A Cold War in 15 minutes or less. Here we go. Following the Second World War, as previously mentioned, not everything goes so smoothly. Instead, the Allied powers are confronted with an issue even larger than that of Nazi Germany. The expanding Soviet Union. As a result, the world falls into another global conflict, the Cold War. The story, as always, does not have a clear beginning. Rather, it overlaps into that of the Second World War. During the war, the Soviets, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, began to distrust the Western Allies. After France's surrender in 1940... I surrender! Wait, what? France surrendered? Oh my God, no way. The Western Allies made no aggressions on continental Europe until the invasions of Sicily and Italy in 1943. During this time, most of the fighting was being done on the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. Stalin began to believe that this was done intentionally to weaken the Soviets, leaving them with a smaller piece of the European pie once the war was over. Meanwhile, in contrast, the Western Allies were afraid of the communist threat. In particular, the American Red Scare planted a fear of commies into the public. In 1944, after the D-Day landings in Normandy and a series of Russian victories in the East, the Allies began what became known as the Race for Berlin. Each side tried to push as fast as they could for the German capital, as they knew whoever captured it would have the upper hand in negotiations. Inevitably, as I'm sure you all know from watching my first video, it was a Soviet flag that flew over Berlin. Before the German surrender, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and the late U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to be later replaced by Harry Truman, or the Big Three as they were called, began meeting to discuss the layout of post-war Europe. The French Foreign Minister, Le Drapeau Blanc, Google Translate it, was never included in these talks. The Yalta Conference, held in February of 1945, was intended to shape a post-war peace that represented not just a collective security order, but a plan to give self-determination to the liberated peoples of post-Nazi Europe. The Potsdam Conferences, held in the summer of 1945, set out to re-establish European borders in Nazi-conquered territory, as well as restabilizing Europe. At the Yalta Conference, it was agreed that Germany would be split up into 4 separate occupation zones. The British would control the northwest, France the southwest, the United States the south, and the Soviet Union would be granted the eastern half of Germany. The split between East and West Germany fell to roughly where each of the respective armies had progressed to before the German surrender. So, this meant that Berlin was situated within the Soviet-held Eastern Germany. However, Berlin was also split into East and West Berlin, once again the West being the Western Allies and East being Soviet. In 1949, the split was solidified with the forming of 2 separate German states. The 3 occupation zones in the West conjoined, becoming the Federal Republic of Germany. This state would continue to be funded and supported by all 3 of the major Western nations. East Germany was subsequently formed into the German Democratic Republic, which, despite its name, wasn't German, wasn't democratic, and wasn't a republic, man. Okay, so maybe it was actually German, but a democratic republic, not so much. But who could pass up on an opportunity to do a gizment? The GDR was put under heavy Soviet control, and its economy was interwoven into that of the USSR. In between the 2 nations, the Inner German Border, or IGB, was constructed across the entire border to prevent any movements of citizens or military forces between the 2 sides. On April 4, 1949, the Western Allies established NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. This was a coalition between all European nations, along with Canada, America, and Turkey, who endorsed westernized practices, free elected government, and a free market or capitalist economy. Then, in the London and Paris conferences of 1954, the Paris Agreements were signed, granting West Germany full sovereignty, ended the occupation, and allowed its admittance into NATO. This allowed for NATO troops to flood into West Germany, taking up positions along the border. In 1955, as a direct response to this, the Soviet Union initiated the Warsaw Pact, or as it's otherwise referred, the Treaty of Friendship. Yep, I'm actually not lying about this one. The agreement was administered by the Soviet Foreign Minister, in exile of the crumbled Nazi German government, Mr. Rogers. This pact saw the conjoining of Soviet-controlled states who endorsed a communist economy and Sovietism. From here, the Soviets expanded their policy of communist expansionism. This included a militarized occupation of all European nations which made up the Eastern Bloc. These nations are referred to as satellite states. They allowed for a large buffer zone between mainland Russia and NATO forces in Western Europe. While these countries often did have their own elections, the Soviets saw to it that the communist parties were always on top. The USSR used the resources of these countries to fund its own economy, effectively draining the countries into poverty. In April of 1948, the U.S. Secretary of State, George Marshall, devised the cleverly named Marshall Plan. Through the institution of this plan, the United States offered to fund the economies of European nations affected by the Second World War. The United States offered financial backing to almost all Western European nations. An offer was also extended to the Eastern Bloc nations as a means of humiliating their inferior economic practice of communism. These Eastern European nations, out of embarrassment, refused to take the United States' offer. Then U.S. President Harry S. Truman initiated the similarly creatively named Truman Doctrine. The name becomes even ever so more unimpressive upon the realization that it's simply the undoing of the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s. Whereas that practice saw American isolationism from any European affairs, Truman's was quite the opposite. The Truman Doctrine called for the United States to interfere in any Western European nation threatened by an external Soviet influence or by an internal communist uprising. This was the Western Alliance's first steps towards a policy of containment. Containment is simply the act of taking every preventive measure in order to stop the Soviet expansion of communism. In 1948, the Western Alliances instituted the new currency of a Deutsches Mark in West Germany. This cut all of West Germany's economic ties from East Germany. East Germany, which relied heavily on the economic stability provided by the productive West Germany, which was highly industrialized by the Marshall Plan, soon fell into economic despair. As a result, the Soviets enacted the Berlin Blockade to instigate the West into dropping the Deutsches Mark. The entirety of West Berlin was cut off from surrounding Germany. All roads, canals, rails, and other entrances to the cities were blocked off by the Soviet military. The Soviets effectively laid siege to West Berlin, as had been done to them in Leningrad, taking a lesson right from Hitler's book. Okay, well, not actually that book. It's more like a metaphorical, sort of a... Stop. That's not even funny. That's insensitive, and I give up. In response, the Allies began the Berlin airlift. This was the airdropping in of supplies to the West Berliners. Over the duration of 14 months, the West flew over 200,000 flights, providing the West Berliners up to 8,893 tons of supplies each day, such as fuel and food. The Soviets decided not to interfere with the airlift for fear of provoking an open conflict. On May 12, 1949, in light of the massive success of the airlift, the USSR lifted the blockade of West Berlin. Throughout the entirety of the Cold War, NATO troops never actually engaged directly with the Soviets. Had this have happened, a nuclear conflict would have most likely followed. Both sides knew this, and so refrained from making actual conflict with each other. Instead, they battled by trying to influence the outcome of proxy wars around the world by supporting one side with weapons, vehicles, ammunition, money, and other crucial supplies. In 1950, NATO was put to the test on a military scale for the first time. A proxy war, a smaller-scale war within the hierarching Cold War, in which the two major competitors, NATO and the Soviet Union, do not fight directly, had broken out in Korea. The Cold War also saw several more proxy wars throughout the late 1960s to the 1980s. In 1961, the Soviets erected the Berlin Wall around West Berlin. This enclosed the city with no direct connections to the outside world except for a few Soviet-controlled checkpoints. The wall was outfitted with weapon emplacements and watchtowers, with an interior strip containing anti-vehicle trenches and other defenses referred to as the Death Strip. The wall was erected primarily in an effort to prevent the continuous flow of mass emigration from communist East Berlin into capitalist West Berlin. By the late 1950s, the Cold War took on another dimension, literally. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite ever, into low Earth orbit. In the West, the Sputnik crisis soon arose. This was a period of public fear and anxiety about the perceived technological gap between the West and the Soviet Union caused by the launch of Sputnik. The Soviets took another step ahead when, on April 12, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space. Fortunately for the West, these baby steps were nothing in comparison to Armstrong's giant leap. On July 20th, 1969, The Americans effectively won the space race when they became the still only country to have landed man on the surface of the moon. I understand at this point that I have probably caused a great upset to a particular two of you, so in fairness, I will admit these accomplishments may have never actually occurred. Seeing as the sun is just a giant mutant firefly that escaped from CIA testing in the early 1950s, and our reality is merely governed by space babies, you're welcome, John, there is a high likelihood that none of this ever actually happened. However, if, and only if, the Americans did land on the moon, which is made of cheese, by the way, it was most likely to capture the ever-valuable moonlight which emanates from its surface, which has the capability of cooling objects. These harvested moonlights would be used to pioneer the later American invention, the ice cube. Needless to say, believe in your silly conspiracies at your own risk. The space race did actually play a significant part in the Cold War. Space agencies, as well as missions to space, are awfully expensive, especially when you blow up more rockets and failed launch attempts than the French ever actually fired their weapons in all of World War II. On a side note, if anyone wants, I have a World War II French rifle for sale. It's in great condition, never been used, and was only dropped once. In competing in a space race to the cosmos with the Americans, the Soviets dumped billions of dollars into their space programs. This money was diverted from the likes of military budgets and the affording of public services and the production of food. This led to further economic deprivation of the already starved USSR. Space rocketry did serve a use in military purposes, however. Missiles. And they wouldn't be carrying just any old warhead. They would be carrying nuclear warheads. The Cold War saw a massive stockpiling of nuclear weapons on both sides. This became known as the nuclear arms race. From here, a situation of mutually assured destruction emerged. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, however not to be confused with the terrible, terrible cartoon, was the ideology that should either side, the West or the East, launch a missile at each other, that immediate counter launches would be made. This meant that no matter the situation, the outcome would be the same. The entirety of the Western and Eastern alliances would be wiped off the face of the earth. The world was brought particularly close to nuclear war within the Cuban Missile Crisis. In response to the presence of American Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decided to place Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba. After a long period of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached between U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev. People began to grow very frustrated with world tensions in the 1970s and 80s, particularly that caused by nuclear weapons. In 1972, the Interim Agreement on Offensive Arms, or SALT I, was signed by the U.S. and USSR. Signed in 1979, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, or SALT II, replaced SALT I, limiting both the Soviet Union and the United States to an equal number of ICBMs, launchers, and heavy bombers. Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty, START, would later be signed by the early Russian Federation after the fall of the Soviet Union. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union began to crumble, and the Iron Curtain receded back to Russia. Under the progressive policies of General Secretary Gorbachev, the Soviet Union saw a steady decline. In 1980, the Independent Self-Governing Labor Union, or Solidarity, was formed in Poland. It was the first trade union in a Warsaw Pact country that was not controlled by a communist party. The government attempted to destroy the union by imposing martial law in Poland, but in the end it was forced to negotiate with Solidarity. The round table talks between the government and the Solidarity-led opposition led to the semi-free elections in 1989. Soon, a Solidarity-led coalition government was formed, leading to the Polish independence from the Soviet Union. Uprising in many other Soviet satellite states soon followed, and they soon too began to declare their independence from the USSR. The fall of the Berlin Wall began on November 9, 1989. New border crossings were opened to allow for semi-free passage into and out of West Berlin. On June 13, 1990, the East German military officially began dismantling the wall. These marked critical steps for the formation of a united Germany. German reunification along the democratic lines of the West German government was finally reached on October 3, 1990, with the dissolution of East Germany. On June 12, 1991, Boris Yeltsin won 57% of the popular vote in the democratic elections of Russia. Following Yeltsin's election as president, Russia declared itself independent. Communist rule in the Soviet Union was ended indefinitely, dissolving the only remaining unifying force in the country. From here, the rest of the Soviet satellite states declared their own independence. On December 26th, the upper chamber of the Union's Supreme Soviet voted both itself and the Soviet Union out of existence. Power was finally officially handed over to Boris Yeltsin as the first president of the Russian Federation on December 13th of 1991. On November 1st of 1993, the EU,
Sports. It's in the game.
or European Union, was established. This was based off of earlier free trade agreements in Western Europe. This was done to allow for free trade, movement, and a unified currency between all of Europe. Almost all European nations, East and West, joined. Fortunately for the whole of the world, through the combination of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the formation of the EU, the global theater finally stabilized. Conflict was forever ridden from world affairs, and in light of the near devastation of all of mankind through the Cold War, warfare would never be seen again.
Oh, say can you see?
Just kidding. Every good superhero's gotta get drunk and start a bar fight now and then. Right?
By the concert.